everyone. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Andrew Townsend. I'm marketing operations here at Smarty. Thanks for joining us. We're really excited to talk about international addresses, and we'll get started as quick as possible. But before we do so, let's go over just a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, yes, this webinar will be recorded. We will get a copy of it sent out to everybody who registered, so you can be checking in your email inboxes for that later today, more than likely. To interact with our presenter and other audience members, feel free to use the chat and the Q&A features that are inside of the Zoom webinar interface. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can, or at least refer you to someone that can answer those questions. We may not have time to take some of your questions, but we'll make sure that we address all of them that we possibly can. All right, our presenter today we have is Brian Amundson, Senior Software Engineer. Thanks, Brian, for taking some time out of your busy day. And without further ado, I'll just go ahead and turn the time over to you.
All right, sweet. It's good to have you, everybody. I spend all day in the international code, so I'm excited about this, and hopefully we're going to present some material that will be helpful to you in your quest for international address validation. So these are some of the things that we're going to be going over. Some of the topics and comparing maybe to some other APIs, and just addressing some of the problems that you may be encountering when you're doing international validation. So let's get started. First of all, country designators. Smarty supports 4 types of country designators, and if you've ever investigated another international API from a company who rhymes with Schmoogle, you'll recognize that there is only one. You have to use the ISO2, but we will accept the country name, ISO2, ISO3, and ISO-N. And you can actually look up. I'm not going to say Google, but you can look up any of those designators if you want to. But we make it pretty flexible for you in that regard. So I think that's enough for country designators. So transliteration, this is it's a very tricky thing to accomplish on the back end. Hopefully we make it transparent enough that you don't necessarily have to worry about it. But what is transliteration? It's basically taking words and converting them from a native form, which in this case is Japanese kanji and hiragana and katakana, and converting them to Latin characters. And so as you can see that we've queried this native query here, it's a mixture of Latin and other Japanese type characters. A native result would be all in native characters, and a Latin result would be all in Latin characters. So I know that there's some carriers that won't accept kanji or any non-Latin characters in the result. And so transliteration is just the act simply of either returning a native result or a Latin result. So how do we do that in our API? You use the language. And so if you specify language, there are 3 options. You can either leave it blank, just not specify a value at all. And in that case, the result should come back with the same character set as the request. Sometimes that's a little bit tricky though, because as you saw in the previous slide, the request can be mixed native, mixed Latin. So what do we choose? And that is kind of a hard thing to determine. So most people specify whether they want it specifically back in native characters for that country or Latin characters. So international, any of you guys who have dealt with US addresses know that there are a lot of oddities and a lot of things that are kind of non-standard. When you get into international addresses, all that just kind of goes out the window. Most countries do have a very firm format that they specify, but when people are involved, who knows what they're going to put in. But we're going to be talking about some of the top countries here and a little bit of the differences between the address formats, how you actually specify the address on a package. So this is UK, Great Britain. This is one of our large international customers, or the customers request a lot of Great Britain addresses. You'll notice that the apartment, which is much different than the US, goes on a completely separate line, followed by the premise number or the house number, or in US terms, the primary number, and then followed by the street. And then there's this thing called the dependent locality, which is kind of an area, or perhaps even a neighborhood, maybe a county. I don't know. It's kind of not super clear, and it varies by places within the country. Locality is typically the city, and then a postal code. And we're going to talk about specifically UK postal codes and Canadian postal codes in more detail, and what some of those, what the postal codes really mean, because they're a complicated postal code system, but it's actually pretty cool once you get to know what they're about. Something about UK addresses is that oftentimes a primary number is not required. If you specify like a building name or a company name, that could be sufficient for the British Post Office to be able to find where you are. So just kind of keep that in mind. A premise number or a primary number sometimes may not be required. Canadian addresses, it's a lot more simple. It's a lot like the US addresses, with the exception of that the secondary number goes first before the primary number. We see this a lot anyway in some addresses in New York. We see that the apartment number will go before the primary number, but in this case in Canada, it's good form. I don't know whether or not it's required. I'm sure Canada Post would still be able to deliver it, but this is the official way. One other interesting thing about Canada is there are two spaces between the province and the postal code. And that apparently for Canadian Post is required, even though I'm sure they're not that picky about it. But that's why you see an extra space in there. So Canada addresses pretty close to US. Japan.
One other question that's coming up about these. So a customer chatted in, we're using International Street API to look up and validate the hotel or property address. They're in the hospitality industry. They say, when you validate a multi-tenant commercial building address, what do you consider to return as an addressee in the response component?
Well, an addressee is a lot like an organization, or sometimes it could be like a building name. We return what our data source provides to us. So we will, if we do have that in the data, we will return it in this proper format, whereas the organization or the building name before the rest of the street. I don't know whether or not that answered your question.
Yeah. I think it's also important to note that we don't typically hold on to who's in the building.
Right.
We have the data for the address and whether it's deliverable, not, and whether it's correct or formatted or standardized. But as far as the organization residing there, we don't have that information.
In some countries, in Britain, I think it's more common than in Canada to actually retain that information, or a building name, right? It's the Tower of London or something along those lines. We may return that information, but we don't try to keep up with who is actually occupying the building.
Right. Another question, UK addresses sent from the US, do you need to include the region and country? For example, Scotland, UK?
That's more of a question with regard to a shipper, and I am not exactly sure. We just return the country with our data, and it probably is fine just to specify GBR. I'm imagining that British Post I don't think I've got that name right, but anyway, I'm certain that they would be able to, based on the locality and the postal code, would know exactly where you're supposed to go.
Okay,
So,
excellent.
all right, Japan. Japan is an interesting animal. There are two different formats. We're just going to be talking about the Latin format here. There is a native or a kanji format, which is completely different. The components are in a different spot. But unless you speak Japanese, it's hard to be able to display it and say, here's where it should go, where the pieces should go. Our International Street API, however, does take that into account, and it does format the address in the proper way if you're requesting Latin or if you're requesting native characters. They love commas in Japan, and they love a lot of hyphens as well. And sometimes street names are just simply numbers. So sometimes you look at an address and you're like, I haven't the foggiest how this address is going to get to the recipient. But if it is a good address, and we'll talk about a good result here in a little bit, it will get to the user. But hopefully this is helpful just to kind of see what some of those components are in a Latin-based Japanese address. France is a little bit like Great Britain in that the sub-building or the apartment numbers are on a separate line. And actually the building number is after that, whereas in Great Britain, that building is swapped. Again, we should return this information this way in our International Street API. So you really don't have to worry about it. There's address 1 through address 8 lines that we can return. And when we return those addresses, we try our best to make sure that it's in the proper format with the proper components in this. Yes, Andrew.
Brian, another question that came up, probably in reference to some of the information you were giving before about native versus Latin. Can you set it up, or will Smarty return both formats, both native and the Latin version at the same time?
Not at the same time, no. Okay. You have to specify one or the other.
Okay.
You have to do 2 queries in order to get both.
Okay, so we could probably set it up that for everyone it does.
Yeah, you can set it up with that. I guess if you wanted both,
skills could probably set that up, but typically it's going to take 2 queries.
It will. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent.
All right, Australia has this concept of a level type and level number. Typically, it's a floor of some sort, but it doesn't have to be. And so sometimes you will see levels in Australian addresses. The sub-building, instead of a dash like it is in Great Britain, they separate it with a slash, but it is basically in the same spot. And in this case, the premise number is 96-100. So I don't know. It seems to be closer to Great Britain than Canada. But anyway, there's the Australian format. Let's talk a little bit about postal codes. Our 2 biggest traffic countries are Canada and Great Britain. And so I think it's helpful to understand a little bit about postal codes and their meanings. First of all, Canada, it is very strict with its formatting. There's an alpha character, and followed by a numeric, followed by an alpha, and you can see what the format is on that top line there. And they're always separated with a space. So the first alpha represents where you are within Canada. A starts with the East Coast, and then Y goes to the West Coast. And they don't use all of the letters between A and Y. Not sure why, but they split it up. Maybe they figured we better leave a couple of letters here just in case it expands out and we need to split it up even more. But there are 1,638 of those. Of the first 3 characters are what we call a forward sortation area, or an FSA, and there are 1,638 of them from the East Coast to the West Coast. And that's what those first 3 letters talk about. The next 3 character sets are the LDU, or the local delivery unit. And that can vary. It can go anywhere from 0 to 7,000 households in an LDU, depending upon the population base in that particular area. So what you'll see sometimes is that a Canadian address, if you don't get it right, sometimes it will only return the first 3 characters, which basically means, yeah, I have limited it down to an FSA, but I really don't know, there really isn't enough information in your query to be able to narrow it down farther and it down to an LDU, a local delivery unit. So that's one thing to watch out for. If you only get those 3 characters in a postal code, then it's probably not a good address, and you're going to have to narrow it down a little bit further. Great Britain is a little bit more complicated. I guess they've been around longer. I don't know. Anyway, it's a combination of 5 to 7 alphanumerics with a space between the sections. The first section can be anywhere from 2 to 4 characters in length, and it represents just a general area. And that probably also represents a country, whether or not it's Ireland or Scotland or what have you. And it's always in the form of letters and numbers, but it's not absolutely specific about the letters and numbers, since it can vary from 2 to 4 characters. The second section always is in the form of numeric, alphabetic. And it's always 3 characters. And that represents a sector, anywhere from a neighborhood or an area within the neighborhood, down to a street or down to a building. If you get a Great Britain postal code that's less than 6 characters long, that's including the space, chances are it's not a good match. And so you want to have at least 6 characters or 7 characters, not including the space. Including space, it would be 8, in order to be able to get a really know that it's a good match, a good address match. So example, the Tower of London, EC3 N4AB. And that is good enough to be able to get down to that, the Tower of London. Anyway, so that's Great Britain postal codes. There are other postal codes around the world that do have specific meaning. We won't dive into those. Normally, though, they're a very set of numbers. It seems like Great Britain and Canada are the only ones that use letters. There are a couple of other countries that have a letter or a suffix to their postal code, but we just take whatever we give you, and that is what the postal code should be. And we've worked hard to take care of some of the idiosyncrasies of some of the other smaller countries that do require a suffix on their postal code. We make sure and return that to you in the result. So we were talking about how good of a result it is. And we know that in Canada, the first 3 characters mean it's not really good. But there's a result analysis section within every result that we return to you that basically indicates how good this is. And depending upon the country, we may only be able to return results that are only so good. Like, for example, there are some countries that do not have delivery point. The premise is as good as you get. There are some countries that will only get you down to the city level, for example. And so what you need to do is look at what the max geocode precision or the max address precision is. And you can see that just below those top small blue boxes. In this particular country, the max geocode and max address precisions are both delivery point. That's as good as you can get. That means that you know what the actual address is for a particular person rather than a building or a street. So you've got to look at that. If the max address precision is only thoroughfare, then you can't expect anything better in your address precision to be thoroughfare. So always look at the geocode precision if you care about geocodes, and the address precision for how good the address is. The components also, or the changes section also breaks it down by components and tells you how good the result is. So in this particular case, verified large change means that you specified an administrative area, or administrative area could be like a county or something along those lines. But you may have misspelled it, or probably just a misspelling. In this particular case, you'll see that it's a verified large change, meaning that we did actually verify the address, but we had to change your input in order to be able to match the address. The next one that you can see is different than the large change is the dependent locality, which means added, which means you didn't specify it in your input, but we found an address, and so we added that to the result. And that's what added means. Identified no change means that we identified that you specified something in your input, but we didn't really match it on an address. So it could be right. It may not be right, not sure, but we identified it as, in the user input that you were trying to specify in this case, a double dependent locality. And then the other ones, no change, the postal code short, and the premise, that just means that, hey, you specified it in your input, we completely and perfectly matched it in the output. So when you are analyzing international addresses, it is very important to take a look at this analysis section to be able to determine how good your result really was. And these next two slides just basically go over what are the possible values of this. So in this case, what we're doing is we're looking at the top two boxes here, and how good the address can be. If you get an address precision of none, then nothing could be verified. We actually don't return that unless you really completely mess up the address. Administrative area means that you got it down to like a region or a province, or if you wanted to relate it to kind of United States, that would be a state. The locality means that we verified it only down to the city. We couldn't get any more specific than that. Thoroughfare means down to a street level. Premise means that it could be in a range of addresses. It could be like an apartment building or something along those lines. But we couldn't get it down to an actual delivery point. And then delivery point, of course, is where it needs to go, right in the mailbox. In some countries, like I said, premise is good enough. They just figure it out from there. Whoever it is that's delivering what you want to send. The next one is what is basically definitions of what some of those that we already talked about. Verified no change, match the result. It's good. Identified no change, input was identified as a particular component, but we didn't really match it with the result. Added means you didn't specify it in your input, but we gave it to you anyway. Kind of a bonus, I guess, right? Verified large change is the input was changed based on the result that we got. So that is basically all of the material that I've got. Do we want to talk about some more questions?
You bet your bottom dollar we do. Okay, so coming back to the delivering in Latin versus the native, the format changes as well depending on native or Latin typically. So if you put something in and tell it to transliterate to Latin, what format does it return? Does it return the local rules?
It always returns the Latin rules. And Japan is the only one I know about. Haven't spent a whole lot of time in Chinese addresses. But with Japan addresses, we will always return the correct format. If you specify that you want it in Latin, we will always return the format in the Latin format. If you request native, we'll always return it in the native format. So bottom line is those address lines 1 through 8, if whatever we return there should be the format that whatever post office or whatever delivery service, they should accept that just as is with those. So you really don't have to worry about the formats. I think we went over that just so that we could give you an idea of what some of these components mean and how they fit together.
Sure.
But we worry about that for you.
Sounds like we might want to have a webinar on that.
Could very well be. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Another question. Have you worked with addresses from Portugal?
There have been a few, but Portugal is not one of the ones that we get a lot of traffic from.
Sure.
So
that is something that's probably worth mentioning. If you have a need for a particular location, you can go to smarty.com and there's a little chat bubble in the bottom right corner that goes directly to our support team. Real people will respond to that, not robots. And you can tell them, hey, this is where I want, this is where the data I have is. What's the level of coverage you've got there? They're happy to discuss it and make sure that we can build a plan that meets your needs, and they'll be upfront.
And we're very flexible too. If you see a problem in some of the country formats, there's a lot of countries to try to keep track of. And so everything is driven by configuration files. And if something is wrong, let us know.
Yeah.
And we're very fast at correcting our software and making sure that the best version is out there.
Yeah. I'm seeing several other questions coming in listing different countries that we do or don't cover. Mexico, others in South America, Brazil. There's some questions.
Mexico's pretty tough. The data from our data sources, and obviously we don't have boots on the ground everywhere around the world, and so we rely upon third-party data sources to help us out. We purchase data and try to put it all together. Some of the data sources in Mexico are not the best. And so it's tough. And sometimes searching is a little bit slower in Mexico because of that data, trying to figure out, this is what you meant. We can kind of match to this. And it takes a little bit more time. Some of the Latin American addresses as well, even though Brazil is large, and we do have fairly good data for Brazil. Sometimes it's a little bit tough and sketchy as well. So, we just have to be patient with us. We're trying our best to make sure that you get the best results that you can get or that we can give.
Excellent. Another question. I didn't see country in the address for your France and Australia examples. Is that because country is not needed for those countries? No,
country is needed for everything. In order to be able to do a query, you always have to specify a country. Now, you're talking about the results, though. You have to specify a country when you query our database. And that's what's nice about us allowing you to specify a country in a bunch of different ways. If you get some data queries from some third party and all they specify is an ISO N, for example, a country number, then, hey, we'll take that.
Sure.
If you use some other address verification service, you're going to have to worry about, okay, what the heck does 826 mean?
Right.
Oh, it's Great Britain. Okay, well, you can't put in GBR. Oh, you got to do GB. We're much more flexible in that regard.
Excellent. The last question that I think we have time for today is, you have a fantastic voice. Do you do any voice work, or have you been in broadcasting?
I have, yeah. When I was going to college, I worked at a radio station in the city where I went to school at. And I've done some voiceovers as well.
But not for Smart.
I have. Well, I'm on the phone system. Does that count?
That's true. You guys call his extension and go to his voicemail. You'll be able to hear his.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
Actually, my son works here and he does a lot of the voice work. So
and his voice is also good.
Yeah.
Also good. One other question that just popped up. Since Smarty is US based, and this user's from Europe, how do you solve the RGPD issue since an address is considered a personal data?
I got to admit, I haven't the foggiest what that is. We're going to have to find out.
It's
and get back with
probably,
you on that.
yeah, it's probably along the same lines of GDPR. The idea is that personal data is owned by the individual. So I think we've had this discussion before, is an address, scraped of all of its other data, is an address an issue?
An address is public domain, basically. We don't give any more information about that address. We will give its geocode, but an address is public information. Because we don't specify anybody's or return anybody's names, I don't think we have to worry about those aspects. Now, I know we have a legal team. They worry about a lot of that stuff.
We worry about a lot of stuff.
We worry about taking the data, making sure that we can find the address and returning it to you. So
very good.
Yeah.
I think you've got one more slide for me. So it sounds like a large part of our audience here may already be using our address. Do you want to go to the last slide for me, Brian?
Oh, sure.
May already be using our international tools or even just our US tools. You can try these out. You can try out different addresses on the single address lookup. You don't have to log in or anything. You just go to that site, smarty.com products/single address. You can also go to resources. You go to the homepage, there's a resources section at the top, and then you can click on single address. Just paste in the address and it'll work fine. You can also do batch address lookups. If you go to the same place, but this time go to list or bulk address checking, you can check that internationally or United States. And then, of course, those are for smaller sets like a single address, or if you want to look up a list. You can also get a free trial if you'd like. I think there's one more click. Yep. You can get a free trial and try our API. You get 1,000 lookups for free with the API. So if you want to test that API, see what it's returning, see exactly how it feels, how it operates, you can set that up and use 1,000 lookups for free to get that figured out. You can set that up at smarty.com. And you can look at the international address, or you can just click free trial, and then you can pick the international set if you'd like. So thanks everybody for coming today. For traveling all this way to come and listen to Brian's fantastic voice, or Brian's fantastic voice.
Yes, it's very sweet of you.
And we'll hopefully see you guys next time. Have a good one.
Take care, guys.